Hello and welcome to this museum accreditation webinar. I'm Heather Lomas and I'm the accreditation advisor for the North East of England and for the East Midlands. And this webinar is going to focus on the second section of the Museum Accreditation Standard, Managing Collections. If you are submitting an accreditation return or you are making a new application to the accreditation scheme, this webinar will help you in preparing your application or your return by covering some of the key issues. So, to get started, the objectives for this session then are to review the Managing Collections section of the 2018 Museum Accreditation Standard, to understand what Arts Council England is looking for in relation to the Managing Collections section and the areas you need to cover. Spend some time looking at key areas that are in the standard, and also enable you to identify any areas where you may need to address support for your accreditation return or your application, so where there might be some gaps that you need to do some work on. So hopefully this will help you identify where those areas are. Just to remind you, this is the accreditation standard, and accompanying it with all of the huge amount of detail that will help you meet the standard is the accreditation guidance document. Absolutely crucial that you access that off the Arts Council website or the Collections Trust website, because it provides you with all the information you need. Just to remind ourselves how the Managing Collections section fits within the whole Museum Accreditation Standard. It's the second section and it covers areas 4, 5 and 6 of the 9 key areas that you have to meet for the Museum Accreditation Standard, and it covers these 4 areas, these 3 areas actually, they're in the red. So those are the 3 areas within the whole standard, all to do with the Managing Collections areas. Just to remind ourselves about the accreditation guidance document, it brings together all of the guidance for all areas of the accreditation standard. It makes it clear how expectations differ for the type and size of museum. So where individual requirements are scaled, it will help explain what is expected for assessment. So do make sure you look at that. It includes key assessment questions, so you can see exactly what Arts Council England is looking for. There's no surprises there. It's all really clear and transparent. Arts Council will signpost other sources of help and guidance too, and Collections Trust provides a full suite of supporting documents on their website. So do go to there and have a look on that too. Just to cover that bit about deciding on the size and type of your museum, hopefully before you even got onto the Managing Collections section, you will actually have looked at the introductory section and looked at the indicators in the guidance on pages 11 to 14, which help you decide on your museum size and type. So make sure you've done that before you start pulling your information together. And this helps you ensure that your application is assessed proportionately. So where it applies, there will be information for different types and size of museum. Okay, so getting down to the detail then, there are 3 areas which fall within the Managing Collections section of the Museum Accreditation Standard, and they're listed here, and they are holding and developing collections, hold useful and usable information on collections, and care for and conserve collections. All key areas of managing your museum, and I'm going to go through each of these 3 areas in detail and look at the different policies, plans and procedures that you need to have in place to meet the standard. So starting off, managing collections, holding and developing collections, so section 4, and there are 2 areas within this. So the first one you have to meet is the responsibility for collections, and the second one is a policy approved by the governing body for developing collections, including acquisitions and disposals. So I'm just going to run through those 2 areas in some detail and pick up the key things that you need to think about. So starting with 4.1, this is taking responsibility for all the collections you manage. So what the standard is asking you to do is to be accountable for your collections, so that you need to know what you own, which collections you might have on loan, and ensuring that you have up-to-date loan documentation. So it's asking you questions about robust ownership and understanding that loan and management agreements, for example, are critical for the long-term sustainability of your museum. So it is asking you that question really about, do you understand how your collections are brought together, which things that the museum owns and which things it has on loan. So areas to focus on for this section are, what size is your collection? So do you actually have do you know what the size of the collection is? And do you know what proportion of the collection is on loan? So that question will be asked within the standard. And are all your loan agreements up to date? So loan agreements should be for fixed terms and ideally for specific purposes. And they need to be regularly reviewed so that it's not an ongoing without any review system. So I think museums need to be looking at that. Another areas you need to think about are, if more than 50% of the collection is on loan, when you make your application or your return for accreditation, you must upload the loan agreements so that Arts Council can see that the loan agreements are meeting current standards. So these are all the things to focus on to meet 4.1. Okay, 4.2 then is a policy approved by the governing body for developing collections, including acquisitions and disposals. And you may well be familiar with this. The Arts Council asks people to develop a policy which underpins the development of collections. And we would call this a collections development policy. It shows how your collections development activities, so that's acquisition, appraisal, deaccessioning and disposal, link clearly to your statement of purpose and meet ethical commitments and legal requirements. This is the only area of the accreditation standard that Arts Council provide a template for, and that's to make sure that museums follow this shared language in relation to acquisition and disposal, and that the ethical and legal considerations are all there for you to think about. So please do use the 2014 accreditation template as the basis for your policy, for your collections development policy. So the key areas you need to focus on are, has the policy been reviewed in the last 5 years? So we would normally expect a collections development policy to have a life of 5 years. So have you reviewed it? Has it changed? Does the policy fit with the museum's statement of purpose? And is it compliant with the legal and ethical clauses that are listed in the template that Arts Council provide? Is there clarity in the description of the collections and areas for future acquisition and disposal? And have you included appropriate information about priorities for rationalisation and disposal? So there are questions in there in the policy which prompt you to think about, have you got priorities for rationalisation? And if you aren't planning any rationalisation, then you need to say that as well. The policy must be approved by the governing body and submitted with the application or the return. So it is something that has to be signed off, and evidence of that signing off will also need to be provided. Okay. Section 5 then is about holding useful and usable information on collections. And this covers 2 areas. So museums need to have an approved documentation policy. And 5.2, they have to follow the spectrum documentation procedures. And I'll explain a little bit about that now. An approved documentation policy, this relates to the information you hold and gather about collections. So the policy or the policy statement ensures that your collections documentation activity that you have is both useful and usable. It's linked to your statement of purpose and it meets the ethical commitments and legal requirements. So the policy should make a reference to Spectrum 5, And Spectrum 5 is the UK Collections Management Standard, of which there are 21 Spectrum procedures. It is managed by Collections Trust and is available as a free download from their website. Just to give you some detail on that, when you're developing a policy document, this documentation policy should ensure that you cover these 4 areas: accountability, so ensuring that there's accountability for the collections and for the information that you hold about the collections, that there's information there about the standards that you're following in your documentation, so some detail about how you're meeting Spectrum 5 and any other standards that you're meeting for your collections information. Information about accessibility, so how are people able to access your collections information? What are your policy overarching strategic aims for that kind of area, so for accessing information? And lastly, you need to make sure it covers security, so you need to think about security of data and how you hold that, security of people's information, so ensuring that that meets all the legal standards, and also about obsolescence of any equipment that you're using or databases, and how you're managing to keep up to date with those, and you have the resources to enable that to happen. So that needs to be all covered in your policy document. You need to think about how your policy fits with the statement of purpose of the museum, ensuring that it's proportionate to the size and scale of your museum, and also reviewing whether it is regularly reviewed and approved by the governing body at least every 5 years. The policy must be approved by the governing body, and it must be submitted with the application or return form. So these are things you need to think about when you're developing your collections information policy for documentation, your documentation policy. Okay, so linked to that, absolutely directly linked to it, is 5.2, which is museums have to demonstrate that they're following the Spectrum documentation procedures. And I mentioned before that Spectrum is the UK Collections Management Standard, and there are 21 Spectrum procedures. So if you want to have a look at all of those, please do go to the Collections Trust website and download the full standard. But for the Accreditation Standard, there are 9 Spectrum primary procedures which are essential for managing collections effectively. And the reason it's important that we follow these is that people need to know that collections are documented adequately, and that the museum is following museum standards for collections information. So you must have procedures in place for the 9 primary areas. And you will need a documentation plan to demonstrate how you are developing access to collections through good documentation. And creating an inventory of all objects in your care is the first step in this procedure. So we know lots of museums might have a backlog of objects which they are not fully documented yet, but the first step in that procedure is to follow the inventory Spectrum procedure to make sure that you're creating that initial list of everything that the museum is responsible for. And alongside this, you also need to create a documentation procedural manual. So you will have created your procedures, so your 9 areas of procedures, and you will have put the procedures into a manual so that people can access that when they're working with the collections. So just to remind ourselves of the 9 Spectrum primary procedures, I've listed them here. So they cover object entry, acquisition, inventory, which I've just mentioned, cataloguing, location and movement control, loans in, loans out, object exit, and documentation planning. So those are the key 9 areas that you need to demonstrate that are being covered by the museum and are listed in your documentation procedural manual. Areas to focus on for this include the creation and updating of the documentation procedural manual. So if you're providing a return, it might be that your documentation procedural manual hasn't been reviewed for a while. So it's a good opportunity to go back and check that things are still working as they were before, or that you might have things to add in or change. So it's a good time. You need to confirm within the accreditation return or application that the Spectrum primary procedures are implemented. So you might not have implemented them for everything because you might have a backlog, but they need to be there in place to be followed. You need to say whether the Spectrum inventory procedure is complete. And if it isn't, you need to detail the expected completion date. So Arts Council is asking those questions. It wants to know what your date for completion of the inventory is likely to be. And once you've got your inventory, you can then move on to make sure that you're complying with all the other primary procedures for all of the objects listed on the inventory. You need to ensure that the documentation plan is available if requested. So everybody needs to have a documentation plan, and you need to supply it if it's requested. And the procedural manual has to be available if you receive an assessment visit. So an accreditation assessor will ask to see it if they come on a visit. Okay, moving on to the third of our three areas in the managing collections section, where this is number 6, which is care for and conserve collections. So 6.1 is for museums to have an approved collections care and conservation policy, and 6.2 is to have an associated collections care and conservation plan. So the policy document or statement shows how your collections care and conservation activity ensures the long-term preservation of collections. It should link to your statement of purpose, and it should make sure that it meets ethical commitments and legal requirements. The policy should outline the duty of care and responsibility towards the collection. And again, it's a policy and it leads into the plan. So it's areas to focus on for the policy. You need to ensure that your policy covers both remedial and preventative conservation. So it needs to look at things that you're doing to protect the collections and prevent conservation damage, etc., but also looking for remedial conservation and how you deal with those areas too. Things the policy should cover are standards. So within that, you might well have carried out a benchmarks in collections care review, and that would enable you to help work out what your priorities are for developing your policy and your plan. The policy should also cover expertise. So how do you access collections care advice? Is that through paid staff, or are you buying in expertise from that for that area? The policy should also cover any specialist collections, or so if you've got working objects, for example, it might be that you have something very special extra put in for that. And it should also include information about how you communicate the policy to everybody who needs to know. So it needs to cover those 4 key areas. And again, with all these policy areas, you have to make sure that it fits with your purpose and your key aims of your organisation. You need to make sure that it's proportionate to the size and scale of the museum, and that it's appropriate for the types of materials that might be in the collection. So you might have very specialist collections. You need to make sure that your policy is appropriate for that. Is the policy reviewed and approved by the governing body every 5 years? Again, it's an area that needs to be regularly looked at, and the policy must be approved by the governing body and submitted with your application or return. So those are the key areas you need to focus on for your policy development in this area. So moving on to the collections care and conservation plan. The standard says that looking after collections is a long-term commitment. So the Collections Care and Conservation Plan sets out your priorities and the activities and the resources required to achieve them. And key areas to focus on for that are ensuring that the plan maintains and plans to improve collections care over a period of time. And using review and assessment of condition and environment, you can identify areas that you want to prioritise. So using benchmarks in collections care is a really good start as a way of prioritising which areas you're going to focus on and where the most area of need is. Benchmarks in collections care is downloadable as a free tool from the Collections Trust website. As a result of your review and assessment, you would create an action plan, then based on the results of the review, and it would cover these key areas I've listed. So an overview of your collections and an awareness of the collections needs, details of your building condition, its maintenance and the impact of that on the collection, how you identify threats to the collections. It would need to include information about pest management and environmental monitoring and control, and also about the resources you have available to you to deliver your plan. So that will be financial resources, it might be access to expertise, it might be staff resources and volunteer resources. You also need to put in there some detail of how you access or contract conservation advice and services. So some information on there is useful. You will need to look within the guidance document to make sure that your plan is proportionate to what is expected, because there is a scaled requirement for this within the guidance. So do have a check and see how that relates to you. Right, that brings us to the end of the 3 sections for the managing collections part of the Museum Accreditation Standard. I've listed a few resources here which will be available with the presentation to download. So these take you to some areas on the Collections Trust website that hold information, and also the Museums Association Code of Ethics. As always, accreditation advice and support is available via your museum development team, so please contact them for support. This presentation is one of 3 presentations we have created to support the accreditation standards. So there is one for organisational health, one for the users section, this managing collections section, and an introductory section to get you started. So please do have a look at all of those different presentations to help support your accreditation application and return. Thanks very much for watching, and good luck.